My name is Lisa, and I'm 37 years old. I live in Denver with my 7-year-old son, Ethan. Our life used to be filled with simple joys, until things took a dark turn. 2 years ago, I met Brian at a local business conference, and I thought my world was finally falling into place. The conference was about sustainable business practices, and I remember being so excited. It was the perfect opportunity to network for my role as a marketing manager and to explore fresh strategies. But what I didn't expect was to meet someone like Brian, who would change everything for me. And Ethan. Brian was a 47-year-old lawyer for the city, tall with dark hair, and he had this smile that instantly made you feel comfortable. He was a decade older than me, but we connected so easily that it felt like no time had passed at all. We spent the whole evening talking, and I remember thinking how intelligent and warm he was. It was refreshing to meet someone who not only listened, but also seemed genuinely interested in my opinions. After the conference, we kept in touch, and our connection quickly blossomed into something more. We started dating, and everything felt so right. He was great with Ethan too, which made me fall for him even more. Ethan, being so young and open-hearted, immediately took a liking to Brian. They would play together, and it seemed like they were building a bond. For the first time in years, it felt like I had found someone who understood me and accepted my son. It felt like we were becoming a family. Within a year, we decided to get married. Brian moved into my house in the suburbs, and for a while, everything was perfect. He helped around the house, picked up Ethan from school when I was busy, and even joked about how he was getting the hang of parenting. I'd laugh, grateful to have such a supportive partner. But little by little, I began to notice changes, not just in Brian, but in Ethan as well. Ethan, who had always been such a lively and cheerful boy, started to become withdrawn. He was no longer the giggling child I knew, and it broke my heart. Instead, he grew quiet, avoided eye contact, and spent more time alone in his room. I thought maybe something had happened at school, so I asked him about it. "Is everything okay, buddy?" I'd ask, and he'd just shrug and say, "I'm fine, Mom, just tired." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then one day, I spotted a large bruise on Ethan's arm. My heart stopped. "What happened here?" I asked, trying to stay calm, even though my mind was racing. Ethan shrugged again, saying he'd fallen at the playground. But it didn't sit right with me. Something about the way he answered, the way he didn't meet my eyes, it just felt off. That night, as I tucked him into bed, I tried to joke around to lighten the mood, but he barely responded. He didn't even smile. As I lay in bed later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the bruise. I felt like something terrible was going on, but I didn't know what. Brian had been acting differently too, coming home late, distracted, and more irritable. The warmth I had once felt between us seemed to have turned cold, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I knew I had to find out what was happening, so I decided to take action. The next morning, I installed a hidden camera in Ethan's room. I told myself it was just to be safe, that I was probably overreacting, but my gut wouldn't let it go. Days passed, and I dreaded checking the footage. When I finally mustered the courage to watch, I saw something that shattered my heart. Brian, the man I had trusted, was yelling at Ethan, his face twisted in anger, his voice harsh and loud. And then, as if the yelling wasn't enough, he struck my son. I froze, unable to breathe. How could he do this? How could this be the same man I had married? I wanted to confront him right then and there, but I knew I had to be smart. I couldn't just explode and risk losing the chance to protect Ethan. I needed more evidence, something that would make sure Brian couldn't talk his way out of it. The next day, I reached out to Brian's daughter from his previous marriage, Jenna. She was 21 and had been distant from her father for years. We met at a cafe and I could barely contain my anxiety. "Jenna, I need to talk to you about your dad," I began, my voice shaking. She looked at me, her expression serious. "What about him?" she asked. "I think something's wrong," I said, hesitating as I searched for the right words. "Ethan's acting differently and I'm worried." Jenna's face darkened and she looked down at her hands. "I haven't had the best relationship with him," she admitted. "He wasn't a great father. He had a temper." Her words hit me like a freight train. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What do you mean?" I pressed, dread creeping into my chest. She took a deep breath. "He was abusive. When I was younger, he would yell and sometimes hit me too." Hearing those words made my blood run cold. I realized that this man I had invited into my home had a history of violence. I had to stop him, not just for Ethan, but for Jenna too. "Will you help me?" I asked, desperate. Jenna nodded, her expression resolute. "Yes, I'll help you." Together, we came up with a plan. She would try to get Brian to admit to his past behavior, and we would gather more evidence. We knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I had to protect Ethan at all costs. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, I couldn't shake the fear that gnawed at me. I kissed his forehead, promising myself that I would do whatever it took to keep him safe. This was just the beginning of a long, painful journey, but I was ready to face it head-on, for Ethan. The days following my conversation with Jenna were filled with tension. I couldn't believe what I had learned, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on me. The man I had trusted, the man who had stepped into our lives, had a dark past that he had hidden from me. And now, Ethan was at risk. Jenna and I agreed that she would arrange a meeting with Brian. She had a way of provoking him, and we hoped that with the right push, he would admit to his abusive behavior. The thought of her confronting him made me nervous, but I knew it was necessary. We needed more evidence, something concrete that we could take to the police. The days leading up to their meeting were agonizing. I watched Ethan closely, trying to act normal, but I could feel my anxiety bubbling just beneath the surface. I wanted to protect him, but at the same time I needed to gather more proof. The hidden camera in his room was still recording, and every night I checked the footage, hoping I wouldn't find anything worse. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. One afternoon, as Jenna and I sat at a cafe, finalizing our plan, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked her, my voice heavy with concern. She looked at me, her eyes filled with determination. "Yes," she said firmly. "It's time I faced him. He can't keep getting away with this." Her bravery inspired me, but I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at my insides. "Just be careful," I said, trying to steady my voice. "We need to make sure you're safe." She nodded, her face serious. "Don't worry, I'll record the whole conversation. He won't even see it coming." The day of their meeting finally arrived. I was a bundle of nerves as I waited, pacing the living room, glancing at my phone every few minutes. Jenna had texted me right before she left, saying, "I'm on my way. Wish me luck." I wished her well, but my heart was racing, my mind spinning with the worst possible outcomes. Hours passed, and I could barely focus on anything. My thoughts kept circling back to the same terrifying questions. What if Brian got angry? What if Jenna wasn't safe? What if this confrontation went horribly wrong? But I had no choice but to wait and hope that everything would be okay. Finally, I heard my phone buzz. It was a message from Jenna. "I got him to talk. I'll come over now." Relief and fear flooded me at the same time. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for her to arrive, wondering what Brian had said. When Jenna walked through my front door, she looked shaken but resolute. "I did it," she said, pulling out her phone. "He admitted everything." The room felt suddenly still, like the air had been sucked out of it. "What did he say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jenna played the recording, and I listened as Brian's voice filled the room, cold and unfeeling. "You were too weak, Jenna. I had to show you discipline. And Ethan, he's just like you. He needs to learn respect. Sometimes tough love is the only way." Brian's voice echoed in the quiet room. I felt sick to my stomach. How could I have been so blind? This was the man I had trusted with my son's life. My hands trembled as I held the phone. I had all the evidence I needed. Brian had admitted it. There was no denying his abusive behavior now. "We have to go to the police," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "He can't keep doing this." Jenna nodded, but her face was serious. "We need more, Lisa. One recording might not be enough to take him down. We need to gather more evidence." She was right. I couldn't let my emotions get the best of me. I had to stay strong and smart. "I'll keep the camera rolling," I said, my determination growing. I'll monitor everything, and we'll get enough to make sure he can't hurt anyone ever again. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, I couldn't shake the knot of fear in my chest. I brushed his hair back and asked him softly, "Do you feel safe, buddy?" Ethan looked up at me with his innocent brown eyes. "Of course, Mom. Why wouldn't I?" he asked, his voice so small and trusting that it nearly broke me. I forced a smile and kissed his forehead. "I love you, Ethan," I whispered, "and I'll always protect you." As the days went by, I kept a close eye on the footage. Every time I clicked through the videos, my heart would race, half hoping that everything would be normal, but knowing deep down that it wasn't. Brian's temper had become more unpredictable. He'd come home late, already in a foul mood, and take it out on Ethan for the smallest things, leaving toys on the floor or not turning off the lights. One evening, while I was making dinner, I heard the front door slam. Brian was home early. My stomach tightened. I quickly glanced at the camera feed on my phone, watching as Brian stormed into the living room. Ethan was playing quietly with his toys, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Dad, look at what I made," Ethan said, his little face lighting up as he held up a paper rocket he had been working on. But instead of praise, Brian's face twisted in annoyance. "What is that mess? Don't you ever clean up after yourself?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. Ethan's smile faded, and he dropped the rocket. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was just playing," Ethan said quietly, his small voice trembling. Brian's face darkened. "Playing? You think life is all about fun? You need to learn some respect," he growled, his anger rising. I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed into the living room, my heart pounding with adrenaline. "Brian, stop!" I shouted, standing between him and Ethan. "He's just a child." Brian turned to me, his expression hardening. "Stay out of this, Lisa. You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know enough to see that this isn't discipline, it's abuse," I shot back, my voice shaking with anger and fear. I had never stood up to Brian like this, but I wasn't backing down this time. "I won't let you hurt him anymore." Brian stepped closer, his towering figure looming over me. "You think you can take this to the police? You really think that will end well for you?" he sneered, his voice low and threatening. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the danger I was in, but I couldn't let fear stop me. "I'm protecting my son, Brian. I'll do whatever it takes." His eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment I saw something dark flash across his face. "You'll regret this," he warned, his voice cold as ice. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with everything that had happened. I had confronted Brian, and now there was no turning back. I had to act fast. The next morning, I gathered all the recordings, all the evidence I'd collected, and prepared to go to the police. I couldn't let Brian continue to terrorize Ethan. This was the moment I had been waiting for, but also the one I feared most. As I hugged Ethan tightly that morning, I whispered, "I love you, buddy, and I promise I'll keep you safe." The journey ahead would be difficult, but I knew I had to be strong. For Ethan. For us both. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was about to face a battle. My hands trembled as I gathered all the evidence, every recording, every piece of proof that I had managed to collect over the past few weeks. It was time. I was going to the police, and I wasn't turning back. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and told Ethan I'd be back soon. He gave me a sweet smile, unaware of the storm that was brewing. "Love you, Mom," he said before going back to his drawing. My heart ached. I knew this was all for him, but I couldn't shake the fear of what might happen next. As I drove to the police station, the familiar streets of Denver felt distant, like I was living in a dream. My mind kept circling back to the question I had been dreading. What if they didn't believe me? What if Brian found out before they could do anything? I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on my one goal, protecting Ethan. When I arrived at the police station, I parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the building in front of me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a second, I almost turned back. But I couldn't. I couldn't let fear win. I was doing this for Ethan, and there was no other choice. I walked inside, my legs feeling heavy, and approached the front desk. "I need to report child abuse," I said, my voice steady, even though my insides were trembling. The officer looked at me with concern and guided me to an interview room, where I was introduced to Detective Ramirez. Detective Ramirez was a tall, composed woman with a kind face that instantly made me feel like I was in safe hands. "Please sit down. Tell me what's been happening," she said, her voice gentle but firm. As I sat across from her, I began to tell her everything. I told her about Ethan's changes, the bruises, the hidden camera, and the recordings of Brian's explosive temper. I could feel the weight of each word as it left my mouth, but as I spoke, I also felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I was sharing the full truth with someone who could help. When I mentioned the recordings, Detective Ramirez's eyes sharpened with interest. "You have recordings?" she asked, her tone serious. "Yes," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I caught everything on camera." I handed her my phone with the recordings, watching as she reviewed them. Her expression shifted from disbelief to anger, and then to something more determined. "This is very serious," she said after a long pause. "We're going to take this very seriously." She excused herself for a moment, leaving the room to consult with other officers. As I sat alone, my heart raced. I had done it. I had taken the first step. But a part of me still felt uneasy. What if this wasn't enough? What if Brian somehow talked his way out of this? Detective Ramirez returned, her expression calm but serious. "We've already launched an investigation. We're going to bring Brian in for questioning, but I need you to be prepared. This process might take time, and it's possible that Brian could deny everything. We need to gather more evidence and build a strong case." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had hoped for a quick resolution, but I knew deep down that this wouldn't be easy. "I understand," I said, trying to stay calm. "What do I do in the meantime?" "Keep the camera rolling," Detective Ramirez advised. "If he shows any more signs of aggression or violence, we'll need that on record, but don't confront him. Let us handle it." I nodded, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and waiting. The police had started their investigation, but Brian didn't know yet. He continued coming home late, his temper unpredictable, while I monitored the footage daily, hoping we would catch something that would finally put an end to this nightmare. Every time I watched the footage, my stomach twisted. Brian's outbursts, his anger, his complete disregard for Ethan's feelings, it was all there, recorded and undeniable. But he hadn't physically harmed Ethan again, not yet. I knew it was only a matter of time before his temper boiled over again. Then, one evening, the storm hit. I was preparing dinner, trying to keep the routine as normal as possible, when I heard the front door slam. My heart skipped a beat. Brian was home earlier than usual, and I could sense that something was off. I quickly glanced at the camera feed on my phone and saw him storming into the living room where Ethan was quietly playing with his toys. "Dad, look at this," Ethan said, holding up a drawing he had been working on. His little face beamed with excitement, but Brian's expression was far from pleased. "Can't you clean up after yourself?" Brian snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Ethan's smile faltered, and he lowered the drawing. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said quietly. Brian's eyes darkened, and before I could react, he raised his voice again. "You think life is all fun and games, don't you? You need to learn some respect." I felt a surge of anger rise inside me. I couldn't stand by any longer. I rushed into the living room, standing between Brian and Ethan. "Brian, stop!" I shouted, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "He's just a child." Brian turned to me, his face twisted in anger. "Stay out of this, Lisa. You have no idea how to raise him." "I know enough to see that this isn't discipline," I fired back, my voice shaking. "It's abuse, Brian, and I'm not going to let you hurt him anymore." His expression darkened, and I saw a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "You think you're going to stop me?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." For the first time, I felt truly afraid of him. I backed away slightly, but I stood my ground. "I'm taking this to the police, Brian. You can't keep doing this." His laugh was cold, a sound that sent chills down my spine. You really think that's going to end well for you? He sneered, stepping closer to me. You'll regret this. Ethan, sensing the tension, tugged at my shirt. Mom? He whispered, his small voice trembling. I'm scared. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around him. It's okay, sweetheart, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You're safe. I won't let anything happen to you. But inside, I was terrified. Brian was growing more dangerous by the day, and I knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. That night, after Brian had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, my mind racing. I couldn't wait any longer. The police had to act, and they had to act fast. I sent all the new footage to Detective Ramirez, outlining the latest confrontation in a detailed message. My heart raced as I hit send, praying that they would take action before it was too late. The next morning, I received a call from the detective. Lisa, we're moving forward with the investigation. We've reviewed the footage and it's clear that this is an abusive situation. We're going to bring Brian in for questioning. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a lingering sense of fear. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely steady. We'll bring him in today, Detective Ramirez said. We're filing charges for child abuse, but you need to stay calm and keep Ethan safe. We'll handle the rest. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. It was finally happening. Brian was going to be held accountable for what he had done, but as much as I wanted to feel relieved, the fear of what might happen next kept me on edge. I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The morning Brian was brought in for questioning, I felt a heavy mix of emotions. Relief that this nightmare might finally be coming to an end, fear of what he might do once he realized what was happening, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty about what lay ahead. I had sent Ethan to stay with my sister for the day, hoping to shield him from the chaos that was about to unfold. I spent the day in a constant state of anxiety, checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for an update from Detective Ramirez. Every small noise in the house made me jump. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. What if Brian talked his way out of it? What if he came home, angrier than ever? Finally, in the late afternoon, I got the call. Lisa, we've charged Brian with child abuse. He'll be held for questioning and won't be coming home tonight, Detective Ramirez said. Her voice was calm, but firm, and I could sense the gravity of the situation. My breath caught in my throat. It was happening. He was being held accountable for everything. Thank you, I whispered, feeling a mix of relief and fear. What happens next? We'll proceed with the case, but we need you to be prepared for the legal process. It could take some time before it goes to trial, and Brian might try to fight the charges. But with the evidence you've provided, we're confident we can pursue this fully. In the meantime, I'd advise you to seek a protective order, just to be safe. I thanked her again, and after hanging up, I sat in silence for what felt like hours, trying to absorb everything. Brian was out of our lives, at least for now, but the thought of a legal battle ahead filled me with dread. Still, this was the right step. I knew that. Ethan and I deserved to be safe, and I couldn't let fear control me any longer. That night, I picked Ethan up from my sister's house. He was full of energy, talking about the fun he'd had playing with his cousins. He had no idea what had happened earlier that day, and for that, I was grateful. I hugged him tightly, holding him a little longer than usual, and he pulled back with a confused smile. What's up, Mom? Nothing, sweetie. I just missed you, I said, smiling at him. But inside, I knew things had changed. We were on the verge of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, but also with the possibility of peace and safety. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, protective orders, and preparing for the case. I had to testify in front of lawyers, explaining every detail of what I had experienced. Jenna came forward as well, bravely recounting her own painful history with her father. Her testimony, along with the recordings I had gathered, painted a clear picture of Brian's abusive behavior. During this time, Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the deeper turmoil. He knew that Brian wasn't around anymore, but I had done my best to explain it in terms that wouldn't scare him. Brian had to go away for a while, I had told him, And thankfully, he didn't ask too many questions. One afternoon, as we sat together drawing in the living room, Ethan turned to me with a quiet seriousness in his voice. "Mom, is Brian coming back?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. "No, sweetheart, Brian won't be coming back," I said softly. "But it's okay. We're safe now." He looked at me for a moment, studying my face, and then nodded. "Good," he said simply, before going back to his drawing. It was such a simple exchange, but it filled me with a sense of clarity. Ethan had felt the tension in our home too, even if he hadn't understood it fully. I had made the right choice. We were on the path to healing. Then came the day of the trial. It was surreal to sit in the courtroom surrounded by lawyers, judges, and strangers, all there to decide the fate of the man I had once loved. Brian sat across the room, his expression cold and defiant. He refused to look at me, and for that I was thankful. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to be reminded of the man who had betrayed me and hurt my son. I testified, recounting everything I had seen and heard, and Jenna did the same. The recordings were played for the court, and I could see the shift in the room as people heard Brian's angry voice, his cruel words, and his admission of guilt. The weight of those recordings was undeniable, and I knew then that we had done enough. We had proven the truth. When the verdict was read, I felt like I was holding my breath. The judge's voice rang out in the courtroom. "We find the defendant, Brian, guilty of child abuse." Tears filled my eyes as I sat there, trying to process the words. It was over. Brian was sentenced to prison, and as he was led away in handcuffs, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a newfound strength. I had fought for my son, and justice had been served. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet kind of healing. Ethan and I moved into a new apartment, a cozy place that felt like a fresh start. Slowly, the tension that had once filled our home began to fade, replaced by laughter and lightness. Ethan found comfort in his art, drawing colorful superheroes and imagining wild adventures. I watched as he regained his joy, his innocence returning piece by piece. Jenna became a regular part of our lives too. She visited often, and we developed a bond that had grown out of the shared trauma we had endured. Together, we found solace in the fact that we had taken control of our lives and refused to let Brian's actions define our future. One sunny afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching Ethan play with his toys in the yard, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. The shadows that had once loomed over us were gone, replaced by a future that was bright with possibility. Ethan ran up to me, holding a new drawing. This time it was of the two of us, hand in hand, smiling. "Look, Mom, it's us," he said, his face beaming with pride. I smiled, tears welling up in my eyes. "It's beautiful, buddy," I said, hugging him close, "just like us." In that moment, I knew that we were free from the pain, free from the fear, and free to build a new life together. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but we had come out stronger on the other side. I had promised Ethan that I would always protect him, and I had kept that promise. We were safe now, and the road ahead was ours to explore, hand in hand, together as a family.